The fluorescent lights of the school library buzzed above me like a swarm of annoyed bees, and I was acutely aware of every single one of my sweat glands betraying me. I saw Mika across the table, her perfect posture and that infuriatingly calm expression as she flipped through her calculus textbook, and I felt my stomach do that weird flip-flop thing I refused to acknowledge. I was supposed to be studying, but instead I was replaying the moment from 3 days ago, the Polaroid, the flash, her hand grabbing mine as we both lunged for the same book, and the way the camera captured it as something it absolutely was not. I knocked over my pencil case, scattering pens everywhere, and Mika looked up with one raised eyebrow. "Nervous about the exam, or is that just your default state around me?" she said, and I felt heat crawl up my neck like I'd just run a marathon. I wanted to disappear into the floorboards. The yearbook had arrived, and I watched from my desk as copies were passed around like forbidden contraband, students pointing and giggling at the glossy pages. I saw Mika across the classroom, her face frozen in that particular shade of panic I'd never seen before, and my heart dropped because I already knew what they were all looking at. I felt my chest tighten as I grabbed my own copy, my fingers trembling against the smooth cover, and there it was, our photo, front and center under the header cutest couple, and I could actually feel my soul leave my body. I made a sound that was somewhere between a wheeze and a dying wail, and Mika's head snapped toward me with an expression that screamed, "I'm going to murder you." "I didn't do this," she hissed across the room, and I wanted to shout back, why would I choose to ruin my own life? But instead I just sat there, clutching the yearbook like it was a live grenade, wondering if the floor would kindly swallow me whole. I was pacing my bedroom, the yearbook thrown open on my bed like some kind of cursed artifact, and I could not stop staring at the photo of me and Mika, the way her fingers were wrapped around mine, the way my face was tilted toward her like I actually wanted to be there. I felt sick, but also something else, something warm and confusing that I refused to name, and I grabbed my flip phone to text my best friend the full catastrophe of what had just happened. I typed frantically, "She knows. Everyone knows. I'm leaving the country," and then I heard my mom's footsteps in the hallway, and I shoved the yearbook under my pillow like I was hiding contraband. My mom called through the door, "Is that your girlfriend in the yearbook? She's very pretty," and I felt like I was going to combust into a million embarrassed particles, because now my mom was involved, and this was officially the worst and somehow best day of my life. The hallway between third and fourth period was a gauntlet of whispers, and I felt every single pair of eyes on me like needles, pinning me to the linoleum floor. I saw Mika approaching from the other direction, her bag slung over one shoulder and her face set in that determined expression that usually meant she was about to argue about something, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat. I tried to walk past her like she was a stranger, but she grabbed my elbow and pulled me into the empty stairwell, and my brain short-circuited because her hand was on my arm and I was definitely making this weird. "We need to talk," she said, and I could hear the barely controlled panic underneath her steady voice, and I thought, great, this is where she tells me to transfer schools. She took a breath and said, "What if we just go along with it until the recall?" And I felt my entire brain glitch because that was not what I expected. We were sitting on the bleachers after school, the metal cold through my jeans, and I was trying to process the fact that Mika had just suggested we fake date until the yearbook committee issued a recall. I saw her fidgeting with the strap of her bag, her usual composure cracking just slightly at the edges, and I felt a ridiculous, traitorous flutter in my chest because she looked almost nervous. "You want to pretend to be my girlfriend," I said slowly, testing the words, and Mika rolled her eyes, but I caught the ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. "Don't make it sound like a proposal," she shot back, and I felt my face go red because now I was imagining that too, and I needed to get a grip on my own brain immediately. I told myself this was a terrible idea, that pretending would only make things worse, But when Mika held out her hand for a handshake to seal the deal, I took it, and her fingers were warm against mine, and I felt my heart skip 2 whole beats. The diner booth was sticky and smelled like old coffee and fries, and I was sitting across from Mika with a napkin between us that would become our relationship contract, because apparently she needed everything written down. I watched her scribble in that neat handwriting of hers. Rule 1. No eye contact longer than 3 seconds, and I couldn't help but snort because she was the one who kept holding my gaze like she was trying to win a staring contest. I felt a laugh bubble up, and I covered my mouth with my hand, but Mika glared at me with mock seriousness. This is a legal document, Sora. Take it seriously, she said, and I reached across the table to grab the pen, our fingers brushing, and I felt a jolt of something electric that made me drop the pen immediately. Rule 2, I added, writing in messy scrawl, you have to pretend to laugh at my jokes, and Mika read it and actually laughed, a real one, and I felt like I'd won something I didn't know I was competing for. We were in the record store, flipping through vinyl bins with the kind of forced casualness that screamed we are not actually dating, and I was hyper-aware of every inch of space between us. I saw Mika pull out a copy of some band I'd never heard of, her eyebrows raising with genuine interest, and I thought, she actually has taste, that's annoying. I said, I thought you only listened to classical, just to bait her, and she turned to me with a look that was half offense, half amusement. I am a multifaceted human being, Sora. Shocking, I know, she said, and I couldn't stop the smile that spread across my face, which was a problem because I was supposed to be cool about this whole thing. I felt my heart do that stupid flutter again, and I dropped the record I was holding, the plastic cover clattering loudly on the floor, and Mika laughed, actually laughed, and I thought, maybe pretending isn't the worst thing in the world. The talent show backstage was chaos, and I was definitely hiding behind a curtain, peeking out at the crowd like a coward while Mika was somewhere getting ready for her performance. I saw her name on the program, Mika Tanaka, original poem, and I felt my stomach drop because I knew exactly which poem she was going to read, and it was the one I wrote in my journal last week about her. I replayed the moment I'd left that journal open on my desk, the page with the scribbled lines about her laugh like morning light, and I felt like I was going to throw up because there was no way she could have found it, no way she would be that cruel. But then the curtains parted, and Mika stepped onto the stage, her eyes finding mine in the darkness, and she began to read, and I felt my entire world tilt sideways because those were my words, my feelings, and she was saying them like they were hers. I stood frozen in the wings, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the entire audience could hear it, and I watched Mika recite my poem with a confidence I could never dream of possessing. I thought, she stole my journal, and then I thought, she stole my journal and she's reading it to the whole school, and then I thought, why does she sound like she means it? I saw her glance at me again, a tiny almost there smile, and I felt my face burn like I'd been standing in direct sunlight for hours, because she was saying all the things I'd never had the courage to tell her, and she was saying them like they were true. I wanted to run, I wanted to disappear, but I also wanted to step onto that stage and tell everyone that those were my words, that she was my poem, that I had been writing about her for months and I'd been too scared to admit it. The crowd erupted in applause, and I watched Mika take a bow, her cheeks flushed with something that looked like genuine embarrassment, and I couldn't breathe. I saw her walking toward me, the program still clutched in my sweaty hands, and I wanted to yell, "What were you thinking?" But the words got stuck in my throat because she looked so happy, so proud, and I realized I was feeling something that wasn't anger at all. She reached me backstage, and before I could say anything, she whispered, "I found your journal," and I thought you wanted someone to say it for you. I felt my chest tighten, my eyes sting with something hot and dangerous, and I said, "That was private," but my voice cracked, and I knew she heard the lie underneath. Mika didn't apologize, she just looked at me with those impossibly warm eyes and said, "Then why did you write it about me?" The hallway after the talent show was empty, and I was leaning against the lockers, trying to process the fact that Mika had just publicly recited my love poem to the entire school. I saw her approaching slowly, her hands shoved in her pockets, and I felt my heart race because she looked almost vulnerable now, like she wasn't sure if she'd made a terrible mistake. I wanted to yell at her, but instead I just said, "Why did you do that?" And my voice came out softer than I intended, like I was asking her something much bigger. Mika stopped in front of me, and she didn't meet my eyes, just stared at my shoes, and I saw her shoulders rise and fall with a shaky breath. "Because I wanted to say those words too," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "and I didn't have the guts to write them myself." I felt my entire body go still, the air leaving my lungs, because she was telling me that my feelings weren't one-sided, and I had no idea what to do with that information. We were in the empty classroom, the one with the big windows that overlooked the football field, and I was sitting on the teacher's desk because I needed to be higher up to feel like I had any control over this situation. I watched Mika pace back and forth, her hands running through her hair in that gesture she did when she was frustrated, and I felt a weird warmth spread through my chest because she was nervous, and that meant this mattered to her. I said, "So you stole my journal, read my private thoughts, and decided the best course of action was public humiliation," and Mika stopped pacing, turning to face me with a look of pure exasperation. "I was trying to be romantic," she said, "and I couldn't help it." I laughed, a loud, surprised laugh that echoed off the empty walls, and Mika's mouth twitched like she was fighting a smile. "You have a really weird definition of romance," I said, and she threw a chalk eraser at me, and I felt lighter than I had in weeks. The school rooftop was off limits, but we'd climbed up anyway, because apparently the only way to have a private conversation was to break multiple safety codes. I sat on the gravel, hugging my knees to my chest, and I watched Mika sit down next to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her arm. I felt my heart hammering against my ribs, and I thought, this is fine, this is normal, friends sit on rooftops together all the time, but my brain wasn't fooling anyone, least of all myself. Mika said, "I didn't just find your journal. I read it, and I couldn't stop reading it, because you wrote about me like I was something special," and I buried my face in my knees because I couldn't look at her while she said things like that. I felt her hand touch my shoulder, light and tentative, and I whispered, "You are something special. That's the whole problem." And I wanted to disappear, but I also wanted her to say something back. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that looked like a bad 90s music video, and I was acutely aware of how close Mika was sitting beside me on the rooftop. I saw her profile, the way the warm light caught the edge of her jaw, and I felt my breath catch in my throat because she was beautiful, and I was allowed to think that now, apparently, because she'd read my journal and hadn't run away screaming. I said, "So if you liked what I wrote, and I wrote it about you, does that mean," and Mika cut me off, her voice sharp but not unkind, "Yes, you idiot. It means I like you too." I felt my entire face go red, and I made a sound that was definitely not a word, and Mika laughed, that warm laugh that I'd written about in my stupid, incriminating journal. I was a complete disaster, but she was still here, still looking at me like I was something worth waiting for, and I felt like I was floating. The yearbook committee had announced the recall, and I was holding the official notice in my hand, the paper crinkling because my grip was too tight. I saw Mika across the quad, surrounded by her debate team friends, and I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach because the fake dating was supposed to end now, and I hadn't prepared myself for that at all. I thought, this is good, this is what I wanted, no more pretending, but my heart was screaming the opposite, and I felt sick with the weight of all the things I hadn't said. I walked over to Mika, my legs feeling like they were made of jelly, and I opened my mouth to say, "I guess we're done here," but what came out was, "I don't want to destroy the photo." Mika looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something flicker in her eyes that I couldn't quite name. "Neither do I," she said, and the relief that flooded through me was almost embarrassing. We were in the yearbook office, the Polaroid in question sitting on the desk between us like a tiny, damning piece of evidence, and I was trying to decide if I had the courage to say what I was actually thinking. I saw Mika reach for the photo, her fingers hovering over it, and I felt my heart stop because I was terrified she was going to tear it up and pretend none of this ever happened. "We don't have to get rid of it," I said, my voice barely a whisper, and Mika's eyes met mine, her expression unreadable. I thought, just say you want to keep it, and I was mentally screaming at myself to be brave for once in my miserable life. Mika picked up the Polaroid, looked at it for a long moment, and then she said, "I want to keep it," and I felt the breath leave my lungs in a rush. "As a souvenir," she added quickly, but her ears were red, and I knew it was more than that. I reached out, my fingers brushing hers, and I felt that same electric shock. The coffee shop was small and cramped, the kind of place that smelled like old books and burnt espresso, and I was sitting across from Mika with the Polaroid between us like a third wheel. I watched her trace the edge of the photo with her thumb, her expression soft and distant, and I felt my chest ache with the sheer tenderness of the moment. I said, "So we're really doing this? Keeping the photo and pretending the whole fake thing was never fake?" And Mika's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing with playful annoyance. "Why do you have to overcomplicate everything?" she said, and I couldn't help but laugh because she was right. I was overthinking. I was always overthinking. I felt the warmth of her hand as she reached across the table and covered mine, and I thought, this is real, this is actually happening, and I was terrified and thrilled and completely, utterly gone for her. We were in the record store again, but this time it felt different, like the air itself was charged with something new and fragile. I watched Mika pull out a cassette tape, a mix she'd made for me, and I felt my heart skip because she'd written Sora's top 10, for when you're being dramatic, on the label in her neat handwriting. I said, "You made me a mixtape. That's so incredibly 90s of you," and Mika rolled her eyes, but I saw the smile she was trying to hide. "You're impossible," she said, but her voice was warm, affectionate, and I felt a giddiness rise up in me that I couldn't contain. I took the tape from her, our fingers brushing, and I thought, I'm going to listen to this on repeat until the tape wears out, and I knew I was in deep, completely and hopelessly in deep, and I didn't care anymore. The arcade was loud and smelled like stale pizza and cheap prizes, and I was standing in front of the claw machine, trying to win a stuffed cat that Mika had pointed out earlier. I saw her watching me from behind, her arms crossed and her expression one of amused disbelief, and I felt a competitive fire ignite in my chest because I was going to win that cat if it killed me. I dropped another token in, my concentration laser-focused, and I heard Mika say, "You're adorable when you're this determined," and I almost dropped the joystick because she'd called me adorable. I felt my face go red, and I missed the claw by a mile, and Mika laughed that beautiful laugh and said, "Let me show you how it's done." I stepped aside, my heart racing, and when she won the cat on her first try, I felt absolutely no bitterness, only the overwhelming urge to kiss her. The parking lot was empty and dark, the only light coming from the flickering sign of the arcade behind us, and I was holding the stuffed cat that Mika had won for me like it was made of gold. I saw her leaning against her car, her hands in her pockets, and I felt the weight of everything unspoken between us pressing down on me. I said, "Thank you, for the cat, and for everything," and Mika's expression softened in a way that made my heart ache. "You don't have to thank me, Sora," she said, and she stepped closer, and I felt my pulse skyrocket because she was right there, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes. I wanted to say something, anything, but my brain had officially shut down, so I just stood there like an idiot, holding a stuffed cat, and Mika laughed softly and said, "You're impossible," but she was leaning in, and I felt my entire world narrow to the space between us. The photograph was in my hand, the Polaroid of me and Mika in the library, the one that started all of this, and I was looking at it in the dim light of my bedroom. I saw our faces, startled and flustered and close, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest because it wasn't fake, it had never been fake, and I had the proof in my hands. I thought, I can't believe I almost let her destroy this, and I pressed the photo to my chest like it was something precious, because she was. My flip phone buzzed on my nightstand, and I saw Mika's name on the screen, and my heart did that familiar flip as I read her message. Are you thinking about me right now? I typed back, maybe. Shut up. And then I added, also yes. And I could almost hear her laugh through the pixelated screen, and I felt like the luckiest disaster in the world. The campus was empty, and we were walking side by side under the flickering streetlights, our shoulders brushing every few steps in a way that felt deliberate but also completely unplanned. I saw Mika glancing at me from the corner of her eye, and I caught her doing it, and we both looked away at the same time, embarrassed and giddy. I said, so, what happens now? The recall happened, the photo is safe, we're not faking anything anymore, and I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest because I needed to know where we stood. Mika stopped walking, turning to face me, and her expression was so open and honest that it took my breath away. Now we do it for real, she said, and she reached out and took my hand, her fingers lacing through mine, and I felt tears prick at my eyes because I was happy, so stupidly happy, and I didn't know what to do with all of it. We were sitting on the same bleachers where we'd made our fake deal, and I was tracing the lines on Mika's palm with my finger, trying to memorize every detail. I saw her watching me, her expression soft and unguarded, and I felt my heart swell with a feeling so big I couldn't contain it. I said, you know, I didn't expect any of this when I got my photo taken that day. I was just trying to grab my textbook, and Mika snorted, her thumb stroking the back of my hand. You ruined my life, she said, but her voice was warm, affectionate, and I knew she didn't mean a word of it. I felt myself smiling so wide my cheeks hurt, and I leaned my head against her shoulder, breathing in her scent, and I thought, I want to remember this forever, and I made a mental note to take another Polaroid, a real one, to keep for myself. The yearbook office was closed, but we'd snuck in anyway, because apparently breaking rules was our new thing now. I saw the box of recalled yearbooks, the ones with our photo inside, and I felt a surge of something protective as I watched Mika pull one out and flip to the page. We should keep this, she said, and she looked at me with such earnest hope that I felt my knees go weak. I said, you want to keep the evidence of our greatest scandal, and Mika laughed, bright and clear, and she said, I want to keep the evidence of the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I felt my face flush, and I grabbed the yearbook from her, hugging it to my chest like it was a treasure. Fine, I said, but I'm keeping it at my house, so you have to come over to see it. And Mika smiled, that smile that I'd written about, that smile that made my world tilt, and she said, I'd like that. The photo was new, a fresh Polaroid taken just minutes ago, and I was holding it carefully by the edges as the image slowly developed in the warm glow of the setting sun. I saw Mika's arm around my shoulder, my head tilted back, laughing at something she'd whispered in my ear, and I felt like I was looking at a different person than the one in that first photograph. I thought, this is the one that matters, this is the real one, and I felt a deep, steady warmth settle in my chest, a feeling I could finally name as happiness. Mika leaned over to look at the photo, her breath warm against my cheek, and she said, we look good together, with such simple certainty that I felt tears sting my eyes. I turned to her, my heart so full it ached, and I said, we do. And I knew, with absolute clarity, that this was the start of something real, something I never wanted to end, and I let myself feel every moment of it. The yearbook office was cluttered with old issues and the smell of stale paper, and I was staring at the two committee members who had cornered me and Mika like we were celebrities. I saw them holding up the original Polaroid, grinning with that terrible we have an idea expression, and I felt my stomach drop because I already knew this was going to be a disaster. They wanted to do a Where Are They Now spread for a special edition, a follow-up on the cutest couple from last year's yearbook, which meant we had to pretend to be photogenic and charming on purpose. I opened my mouth to say absolutely not, but Mika elbowed me in the ribs and said, "We'd love to," with that infuriatingly calm smile that made me want to strangle her. I thought, we are going to regret this so much, and I could already feel the embarrassment creeping up my neck like a fever. We were walking across the quad, the yearbook committee's deadline looming, and I was still processing the fact that Mika had volunteered us for a full spread without consulting me. I saw her fidgeting with her bag strap, which meant she was nervous too, and I felt a tiny, petty satisfaction that she wasn't as cool as she pretended to be. "You could have asked me first," I said, and Mika stopped walking, turning to face me with that look that always made my brain short-circuit. "I thought it would be fun," she said, and I felt my heart skip because she looked almost vulnerable, like she was worried I'd say no. I rolled my eyes, but I was already smiling, because she was ridiculous and I was completely gone for her. "Fine, but we're doing this my way," I said, and she raised an eyebrow. "Your way involves tripping over nothing and knocking over a display, doesn't it?" I felt my face go red, because she knew me too well. The library was eerily quiet, and we were standing in the exact spot where the first Polaroid was taken, surrounded by towering shelves and the musty smell of old textbooks. I saw Mika positioning herself exactly where she'd been months ago, her hand outstretched toward the same shelf, and I felt a wave of nostalgia so intense it almost knocked me over. I thought, we're really doing this, we're recreating our origin story, and I was equal parts embarrassed and thrilled. The committee member raised the camera, and I reached for the book just like before, but this time I was hyper-aware of Mika's fingers brushing mine, and I felt that familiar electric jolt. I made the most ridiculous sound, a kind of startled squeak, and Mika laughed, that loud unguarded laugh, and the camera flashed, capturing us mid-laugh instead of mid-fight. "Perfect," Mika said, and I wanted to argue, but I couldn't stop smiling. The Polaroid was developing in my hand, the image slowly emerging from the blank white, and I could already tell it was going to be a disaster. I saw my face, eyes half closed, mouth open in what looked like a laugh-cry hybrid, and Mika's head thrown back, her expression pure joy, and I felt a sinking feeling because I looked absolutely unhinged. "We are not using this," I said, but Mika snatched the photo from my hand and held it up to the light, her eyes soft and warm. "It's perfect," she said, and I felt my entire face go red because she meant it. She actually meant it. I said, "I look like a startled pigeon," and Mika turned to me, her smile impossibly fond, and she said, "You look like you're happy. That's my favorite version of you." I felt my heart squeeze so tight I couldn't breathe, and I wanted to kiss her right there in the library, but the committee member was still watching. The phone rang at 7 p.m., and I answered it without checking the caller ID, which was my first mistake. I heard Mika's mom on the other end, her voice bright and warm, inviting me to dinner because she'd found the most adorable photo of you two and wanted to hear the whole story. I felt my blood run cold, because that photo was the original Polaroid, and Mika's mom had clearly found it in Mika's room, and now I had to sit through a family dinner and pretend this was a normal, non-fake relationship that had started in a completely normal, non-traumatizing way. I stammered out an agreement, my voice cracking twice, and I hung up and immediately texted Mika, "Your mom found the photo. We're doomed." Mika replied, "Relax. Just be yourself. She loves you already." I thought, she loves the fake version of me, and I wanted to crawl into a hole. The dinner table was covered in homemade food, and I was sitting across from Mika, my legs trembling under the table, trying to remember how to form complete sentences. I saw Mika's mom smiling at me with that knowing look that all moms had, like she could see right through my entire existence, and I felt my face burn because she kept refilling my glass of water like I was a dehydrated kitten. Mika's dad asked, "So, how did you two really meet?" And I opened my mouth to tell the truth about the fight over a book, the flash, the accidental photo, but Mika kicked my ankle under the table. "We were studying," Mika said smoothly, "and I just knew she was the one." I felt my heart stop, because she said it so easily, so naturally, and I realized she wasn't faking anymore. The dessert was a chocolate cake that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, and I was trying to cut a small piece without making a mess, which was proving impossible because my hands were shaking. I saw Mika's mom lean forward, her eyes twinkling, and she asked, "So when did you know she was the one?" And I froze, my fork hovering in midair, because I didn't know how to answer that without confessing everything. Mika set down her fork, and she looked at me with such soft, unguarded warmth that I felt my breath catch. "The day she dropped her pencil case," she said, and I realized I'd rather help her pick up her pens than win any argument. I felt tears prick at my eyes, because she remembered that, because she'd been paying attention even then. I said, "I knew when you didn't laugh at my bad puns," and Mika snorted, and her mom clapped her hands together like we'd just performed a magic trick. Mika's bedroom was covered in band posters and stacks of CDs, and I was sitting on her bed, holding the original Polaroid that had started all of this, turning it over in my hands like it was a sacred object. I saw Mika close the door behind her, her expression shifting from polite daughter to the real, messy, wonderful girl I was falling for, and I felt my chest tighten with the weight of everything we'd been through. "I was terrified you'd want to destroy this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and Mika sat down next to me, her shoulder pressing against mine. "I was terrified you'd want to keep it," she admitted, and I felt the humor of the situation hit me. Two idiots, so afraid of the same thing, pretending the whole time. I laughed, a shaky, relieved laugh, and I leaned into her, breathing in her scent, and I thought, I'm never letting this go. The yearbook special edition had arrived, and I was staring at the glossy pages, at the side-by-side comparison of our original Polaroid and the new one from the library. I saw Mika's arm around my shoulder in both photos, but the second one was different. Our faces were relaxed, genuine, full of something I could finally name as love. I felt a surge of pride and embarrassment and joy all tangled together, and I couldn't stop the grin that spread across my face like a kid on Christmas morning. Mika appeared beside me, her voice teasing, "We're famous," and I nudged her with my elbow. "We're ridiculous," I corrected, and she laughed, that sound I'd written about in my journal, the sound I now got to hear every single day. I closed the yearbook and held it to my chest, and I thought, this is our story, and I want to remember every page. The record store was empty except for the owner, who was too busy reading a magazine to care about two teenagers giggling in the vinyl aisle. I watched Mika pull out a record, some obscure indie band from 1994, and she held it up with a triumphant grin. "This is the one," she said, and I felt my heart do that familiar flip because she was so excited, so genuinely happy, and I wanted to bottle this moment forever. We bought it together, splitting the cost, our fingers brushing as we handed over the crumpled bills, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the store. I said, "So this is our first joint purchase," and Mika smirked. "That's basically a marriage contract in the 90s, she said, and I laughed so hard I knocked over a display of cassette tapes, and she helped me pick them up, and I knew I'd do this forever with her. My bedroom was a mess of papers and clothes, but the journal was open on my bed, the pages filled with my messy handwriting and now, Mika's neat script underneath it. I saw her sitting cross-legged on my floor, chewing on the end of my pen, adding sarcastic commentary to my latest entry, and I felt a giddiness rise up in me that I couldn't contain. I wrote, "Today she said I was her favorite version of myself," and she added below, "I said that because it's true, you idiot." I felt my face flush, and I threw a pillow at her, but she caught it and threw it back, and we ended up in a giggling pile on my bed, the journal forgotten beside us. I thought, this is what I want, messy, silly, real, and I reached for her hand, and she squeezed mine, and I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The rain was coming down in sheets outside the library window, and we were stuck inside, the same library where everything had started, but this time it felt like coming home. I saw Mika pull out her Polaroid camera, the one she'd bought just for us, and she pointed it at me with that mischievous glint in her eyes. "One more," she said, and I groaned, but I was already smiling, because I couldn't help it around her. I reached for a book, the same one from the original photo, and I held it up like a shield, and Mika pressed the shutter, the flash blinding me for a second. When the photo developed, it showed me laughing, my eyes squeezed shut, and Mika's hand reaching into the frame to adjust my collar, and I felt my heart ache with how perfect it was. "This is the one," I said, and she nodded, her voice soft. It always was. I was alone in my room, the 3 Polaroids laid out on my desk side by side, the accidental one, the silly recreation, and the rain-soaked selfie. I traced the edge of each photo with my finger, feeling the smooth paper, and I thought about how much had changed in such a short time. I had been so afraid of being seen, of being known, and now I had someone who saw all of me, the awkward, messy, self-deprecating disaster, and stayed anyway. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but I was smiling, because these weren't sad tears, these were the kind that came from too much happiness to contain. My flip phone buzzed, and I saw Mika's message. "Are you comparing the photos again, nerd?" I typed back, "Maybe. Shut up." And then I added, "Thank you for staying." And I meant it with my whole heart. The rooftop was bathed in orange sunset light, and we were sitting side by side, our shoulders pressed together, the city sprawling out below us like a postcard from the 90s. I saw Mika's profile, the way the golden light caught her eyelashes, and I felt my chest swell with a love so big I thought it might burst out of me. She turned to me, her expression soft, and she said, "I don't want to forget any of this," and I felt my heart squeeze because I knew exactly what she meant. "You won't," I said, and I pulled out the newest Polaroid, the one from the library, and I placed it in her hand. "I'll make sure of it." She smiled, that warm, unguarded smile that I'd fallen in love with, and she leaned her head on my shoulder, and I felt the weight of her trust, her love, her entire being, and I held onto it like the precious thing it was. The corkboard in my room was covered in memories, the 3 Polaroids, the mixtape label, a receipt from the record store, and a napkin with our contract still smudged and wrinkled. I sat on my bed, holding the journal open to the final page, and I thought about forgetting how I'd spent so long trying to forget my fear, my embarrassment, my secret feelings. And now I had this real, beating, beautiful thing that I never had to pretend about again. I heard Mika's footsteps in the hallway, my mom letting her in, and I felt a grin spread across my face because she was here, she was always here now. She appeared in my doorway, holding the original Polaroid, and she said, "I think we need a bigger board." I laughed, and I reached out my hand, and she took it, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would never forget a single second of this. At this point, I'm convinced the universe is just a chaotic screenwriter who binge-watched too many 90s rom-coms. It handed me a rainy window, a cassette tape, and a ridiculously cute girl with zero warning. Like, could I get a script revision? Maybe fewer awkward pauses. But, honestly, I wouldn't change a line. Okay, be honest, did your heart just do that thing? You know the one. Where you're watching 2 girls accidentally hold hands over a cassette tape and suddenly you're grinning like an idiot. If you felt that, if you smiled, if you sighed, if you yelled just kiss already at your screen, then you're exactly where you belong. Drop a comment and tell me, which moment made you squeal? And if you want more GL stories, more 90s fluff, more sapphic tension that'll make you kick your feet, hit subscribe. Because this is Nostalgic Hearts. We're messy. We're soft. And we're hopelessly romantic. I'll see you in the next memory. Two hearts, smiling face with open mouth and smiling eyes.